old Lexi has to do. And so he got on to the jet, and hours later, it was announced that the LexCorp jet had crashed somewhere halfway across the world. Wreckage from the jet was found, as well as a corpse. The corpse was so badly burned, there was no way of recognizing who it was. However, the body had a larger, huskier frame. It appeared that the dead man, the dead pilot, was bald, and also the body was missing a right hand. So that was proof enough for everybody that Lex Luthor had met his very unfortunate end. And while certain individuals, like employees at the Daily Planet building, could publicly wave a sigh of relief and say, well, good riddance to bad rubbish. For a lot of the citizens in Metropolis, this was horrible because they were out of work now and they weren't going to find work in the city anytime soon because, as I mentioned before, LexCorp was the engine that drove the Metropolis economy. And with Luthor gone, it appeared that LexCorp was going to go belly up. And so members of the board had to scramble to find a last will and testament, some kind of documentation showing that there was a succession plan in place. And in the 11th hour, members of the board would find that last will and testament, which revealed that Lex Luthor turned everything, lock, stock, and barrel, to his long-lost son, Lex Luthor II. Well, of course, members of LexCorp's inner core were very quick to go on a mission to find Lex Luthor II, and they found him in, of all places, Australia. And this Lex Luthor II appeared to be completely unlike his father. It appeared that the apple had fallen very far from the tree indeed. He was tall, handsome, very well built, which made sense because he was a farmer. He was not a business executive. He was just a simple farmer who, of course, had built a very good frame on him due to all his hard work on the farm. Spoke with, can you call it a Cockney Australian accent? He certainly had many colloquialisms to use in his speech, but he appeared to be very kind, very innocent. He recognized Gretchen Kelly as his true biological mother, and it seemed kind of weird that Gretchen didn't recognize her own son at first, but one could surmise that after an ill-fated love affair that lasted a very short time with Lex Luthor, decades in the past, she found out she was pregnant, and in an effort to keep hers and Lex's child away from Lex, she was quick to give him up for adoption, and then probably made an effort never to see her son again lest Luthor found out and tried to find his son. So at the time, a reader could say, okay, it's understandable that she's weirded out by meeting her son, even though he appeared to be a very sweet chap. But Lex Sr.'s hapless assistant, Sidney Happerson, what a rat, he also came over to Australia to meet Lex Luthor II, and he didn't really have to make a strong pitch for this. Lex Jr. said, yes, of course I will come back to Metropolis, and I will do what I can to get LexCorp back up and running. And that's exactly what he did. He came back to some fanfare, apologized that he had to meet the people of Metropolis under such unfortunate circumstances, assured people that he was not entirely like his father, so whatever transgressions his father had made, Lex Jr. was going to atone for those and get everybody back to work. And it turns out that's what he did. It turned out that Lex Jr. was something of a savant. Even though he appeared to have no formal background in business administration, he was brilliant when he took his father's place at the head of LexCorp. His biggest challenge really was silencing his critics. And of course, he had 3 or perhaps 4 major critics in Perry White, Lois Lane, and Clark Kent and Superman. Now, Perry White had plenty of reason to dislike Lex Jr. Sometime before, Perry had learned that his son Jerry was actually Lex's biological son as a result of an affair between Perry's wife Alice and Lex Sr. many years before. So Perry came out swinging at Lex Jr. and ended up coming out feeling rather bad for the lad. He said, you know what? Lex the second is kind of like my son Jerry, just a victim of circumstances and poor biological parentage. So Perry was okay with Lex Jr. Lois, who you could say was the Daily Planet's most aggressive reporter, save for Perry White back in the day, she really came out hard against Lex Jr., presented him with all of the horrible things that his father had done in life. And Lex Jr. ended up breaking out into tears and saying that he did not know how awful his father was. It was enough to convince Lois that Lex Jr. was the real deal. And that he was nothing like his father. Clark Kent even interviewed Lex Jr., came away saying, you know what, he's actually an upstanding guy. But what about Superman? Well, the problem was the post-crisis Matrix Supergirl, who I'm going to talk about in episode number 102, had fallen in love with Lex Luthor II. And Superman was quite worried that since she was a very naive individual, she might spill the beans to Lex Jr. that Superman was Clark Kent, and he couldn't have that. So he confronted Supergirl over the skies, the outskirts of Metropolis, and their words actually ended up in some mild fisticuffs, which were caught on tape by a cameraman on board a LexCorp helicopter, in which Lex II was also a passenger. The helicopter came down to the ground. Lex Jr. confronted both Superman and Supergirl, admonished them for acting so inappropriately, given that they were 2 of Metropolis's finest. He told the cameraman to give him the tape, which contained the filming of the fight. He fired the cameraman on the spot, but instead of giving the tape to Superman and saying, here, burn it with your X-ray vision, Lex Jr. said, I'm going to hold on to this tape. I'm not going to distribute it, but just as a reminder for you that I am holding you to a much higher standard, and I expect you to do better going forward. One could say that Lex Jr. was starting to sound like his dad here, but Superman didn't feel that way. He actually saw the sense in this, and he saw Lex Luthor II as an honorable person. And so he too was convinced that Lex Luthor II was good to his word and was good for Metropolis. So with that said, near the second act of this 3-act story, Lex Luthor II told Sidney Happerson, I've done it. I fooled them all. The idiots. Metropolis is mine. And so in the final act of this story, it actually ended in a Metropolis hospital with a scientist who had been badly burned in a lab explosion. And he ended up being interviewed by two police detectives who chose to stay in the shadows wearing these big fedoras and overcoats and talking in hushed tones. But the scientist explained that some time ago he had been employed in a genetics laboratory in Australia. And this laboratory was, of course, run under the auspices of LexCorp. And the scientist explained that one day Lex Luthor II visited the lab and told the scientist and his mentor teacher that the kryptonite radiation had spread to the point where he couldn't just get a new right hand cloned for him. He needed something much more. So what happened was that Lex Sr. actually faked his death in that plane crash. He jettisoned himself out of the plane and he left behind a cadaver that matched his body type for the authorities to find. The scientist went on to explain that Lex Sr. was secretly marshaled to the genetics lab in Australia, where his brain, eyes, and brainstem were removed and kept in a jar with fluid inside so that he was able to watch the entire cloning process. What happened was these scientists took some of Luthor's healthy cells and cloned them. Gretchen Kelly came by to see what was going on, was mortified when she saw this clone being grown at an exponential rate. She left in shock. While the clone was being raised to maturity, Lex was being fed with Australian linguistic tapes so that when he came out of the procedure, he would speak with a perfect Australian accent and speak with completely Australian colloquialisms. A few days passed. Body and brain were united, and a newly cloned Lex Luthor emerged with a full head of flowing red hair, a red beard, very muscular, very tall, very good looking. And later that night, to make sure that there were no witnesses who could come back to Metropolis and explain that Lex Luthor II was actually Lex Luthor I in a cloned body, Lex/Lex II detonated an explosive which destroyed the lab, killed everybody except for this scientist, who would then explain that he somehow made it miraculously to safety, and he was now telling these two detectives a story of what had happened in Australia. Well, the two detectives came out of the shadows, took off the devices they were using to disguise their voices, and were revealed to be Sidney Happerson and Lex Luthor II. And Lex II, looking positively evil, will pull out a needle, or rather he'd have Happerson pull out a needle and inject the lethal formula into the scientist, killing him, thus erasing any evidence that Lex Luthor I had returned. And looking at the counter, I've run out of time, folks. So what that means is that I'll come back to you next week and I'll tell you all about what became of Lex Luthor II and where I think things are going to go forward with the character. Will we see the post-crisis Lex Luthor again? Do we still see elements of the post-crisis Lex Luthor today? Stay tuned for more next week. So until another week has come and gone, this class is dismissed.